Welcome to a special edition of Radical Talks. I'm Molly Welch, and I'm a partner with Radical Ventures. Today, we're taking you inside our annual Radical AI Founders Masterclass. It's an exclusive program where brilliant AI researchers and technical entrepreneurs can learn directly from industry pioneers, drawing inspiration and practical insights from their journeys. In this mini-series, we'll share these transformative conversations from our 2025 sessions, giving you access to the discussions, empowering AI founders to build innovative companies that shape the future. We're kicking off today with a conversation between Radical Ventures partner Rob Taves and the co-founder and CEO of Writer, May Habib. So let's get started. The first voice you will hear is Rob, who will introduce May.
So for this conversation, we are privileged to have with us May Habib, who's the CEO and co-founder of Writer. Really excited to chat today, May. Writer is one of the leading enterprise AI companies, one of the fastest growing generative AI companies out there today. The company offers a full stack end-to-end agentic AI platform for the world's biggest enterprises, the Global 2000. Writer works with a long list of the world's leading blue chip marquee Fortune 500 companies, from Salesforce to Uber to Vanguard. And it's been a real privilege to get to work with May and the Writer team as they've scaled rapidly. So without further ado, welcome, May. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Rob. So nice to be here. I wish I had something like this when we were starting out.
Totally, yeah. And so on that note, just to give folks kind of a lay of the land of how we'll spend the hour. So we'll spend about the next 35 minutes or so in a fireside chat between May and I. And then we'll reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So as Kate said, please do drop your questions into the chat. And please be proactive and eager in terms of any and all questions you have to ask, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And the discussion will focus on May and Writer and her background and journey, but also we'll try to hit on points that are relevant and helpful for aspiring founders and new founders and folks that are in different points on their entrepreneurial journey and their journey with AI. So maybe to start, May, it would be great to spend a little bit of time talking about your background and your journey. You started off at Harvard studying languages, and from there ended up becoming a founder of one of today's foremost generative AI startups. Curious just to hear a little bit about your journey and what drew you to entrepreneurship and kind of how you decided to found Writer and to tackle this problem.
Yeah. I've always been really fascinated with the concept of machines helping us figure out language. I grew up dreaming about what it would look like to have a Tower of Babel of sorts. And a lot of that was grounded in my own personal experience. Eldest child of a family that immigrated from Lebanon to Canada. And, that's very typical that child becomes the interpreter for the whole family who has moved. And so, I've always just been very viscerally really confronted with language as a barrier. And so when Wasim and I met up, Wasim is my co-founder, he's our CTO. I had seen a bunch of the NLP repos that he had on GitHub around this is when we met in Dubai, around really helping NLP researchers tokenize Arabic. And we started on our entrepreneurship journey together. We started a translation company. And this was like before machine learning. I mean, this was statistical machine translation days. And we built a network of translators around the world that created essentially training data for us. And so we sold services to get training data that we then used to build statistical machine translation models. And that technology evolved and evolved. And, the actual product that we built when we moved to San Francisco and, formally set up a company, our first company, was a localization startup. So, via GitHub, essentially, we would automatically create PRs with localized strings when code was checked in that had strings in it, and we would localize into, all the languages that someone needed their application in, and it would just, spit out a bunch of JSON files. So that was our first company. And the underlying machine translation, it's funny, Rob, like we now build our own models and are interoperable with others. And our first company was like that as well, in that like we built some of our machine translation and then we're interoperable with others as well. And, where we built, we had a real incredible kind of early experience with encoder decoders. And it really felt like the start of something very different, very new. And so we shut down Cordoba. We started Writer in 2020, and there was a real kind of like, I don't know what it was, like a calling almost, that we had to go do this other thing. And so you can imagine it wasn't very easy to shut down something that was creating revenue. Like our investors thought we should be spending time trying to sell it, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, no, let's roll it into something else. We got to go do this something else. And what's been incredible is, a company that we started to really work on language has evolved into a company that works on intelligence, because language now is the interface to intelligence and soon to be super intelligence. And our connection to the research and driving a research roadmap is really what has fueled our product journey, our go-to-market journey. And we've been enterprise focused from day one. So there's just a ton of expertise that we in our early team have developed around what the enterprise requires that our competitors don't have. That has fueled, not just the way the product has evolved and the way our delivery methodology has evolved, but also the research roadmap and the kinds of things that we work on. So I'm very excited about, the next 5 years of our journey, knowing what our AI research team is working on now, and what is to come from a product perspective, what we're bringing to market.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, May. And really an incredible journey that you've had, and a lot of prescience to start Writer when you did, and with the focus that you had, and obviously to have seen so much growth over the past few years since then. I'm curious on that topic of going back to the early days of you and Wasim deciding to launch Writer. One thing that I think is remarkable and unique about how you've built Writer from the beginning is that it has always been a full stack architecture, from the models to the infrastructure to the applications, as opposed to just building a particular point solution or a particular piece of the stack. I'm curious to hear more about what your strategic thinking was around architecting the company that way, and what some of the opportunities as well as some of the challenges are for building a company like that.
Yeah, absolutely. In the early days, there wasn't like an LLM API company out there, right? So in a lot of ways, that really only became a fork in the road in 22, right, with the first GPT-3 API, et cetera. And when the GPT-3 API came out, we used our investors, we got access to it, et cetera. And we're like, oh, this is not that much better than what we've got. It was better, but it wasn't that much better. But it really felt like, oh, interesting. We have been trying to productize this. There's a very different business model out there. And that was really the second big question that we had. I think the first fork was really are we prosumer or are we enterprise, right? That was the late 2020, early 21 question, me taking walks in the woods, really what kind of business? It really impacts the shape of the business. The second fork in the road wasn't, do we use someone else's models? It was actually from a business model perspective to the enterprise, is this a dev product or are we going to continue selling, right, a productized application on top of the technology? And the answer that we made is we're productizing, right, applications. Really, the third fork in the road was as this whole category emerged, it was a lot of like investor pressure. I mean, we didn't really feel it from like internal because we were continuing to push the boundaries. We were continuing to get the benefits of scale. We pioneered synthetic data techniques. We pioneered techniques that allowed us to really train models quite efficiently. So yes, we were raising money. We weren't raising billions of dollars. And we weren't buying data, right, with those or spending billions to get it labeled by humans. We had really developed other techniques, and we were meeting and achieving and beating benchmarks, right? And our customers were happy. So it really was only that like third fork in the road, driven more by investor pressure of like, are you going to be able to keep up? Because the customers that were coming along, I mean, it's not that this was not like a check the box, certainly, right, on can they keep up, et cetera. They did have questions, but we were always able to use our history of building and scaling and staying up to date, our publishing, all of the research breakthroughs, et cetera, to get folks comfortable, right, with being on our Palmyra models. I think more recently, from a commercial perspective, we have opened up our agent builder to third-party models now that it is component-based. And so it is much easier for us to be able to just kind of like architect that part of the product to be interoperable from day one. And what's funny, Rob, is 90% plus of the volume still go through Palmyra because it is the workhorse of agentic in terms of accuracy, speed, how we use the context window, how we tie into our native retrieval features, and just overall cost and performance. So, there are always going to be moments that feel, really big, right, in terms of like the decisions. I think it's important to know that you're making a decision that is very consequential, because it's not like I know some founders who sort of have like an important decisions doc. We know there's just like kind of the ambient intelligence of, the decisions that we've made along the way that have been very consequential. And you ask why did we make the decision to be full stack? Because we are so intimate with the technology, we know how important it is to be productizing ahead of the results of scaling showing up. And us being able to know, all right, we're going to have product features around the management of enterprise memory and context engineering, because this is what we're working on in research. We know that we are going to have the LLM as a system of record, right? Because this is what we're working on the research side. It allows us to plan out from resourcing to like the surface area of the product, how to architect the control, the governance, the usage that we think enterprises are going to have for what we end up featureizing. I think that was one really big part of it, is just control over our roadmap, our destiny, and not having to scramble along with the rest of the world once a new model comes out to like figure out what it can do and really productize from there. I mean, it's interesting even now seeing kind of the startup creation lag, right? It's like you get a new model 6 months later, all the agent builders come out, right? Like the generation before you get a new model, all the RAG companies come out. And with the enterprise, you really can't do business that way, right? We can't go and tell them what we've shipped already, right? We got to tell them what's coming, because they're going to make a ton of decisions around what's got to go behind a beta flag, what they don't want in there at all, right? What enablement they create with our help on the stuff that's coming. So, control was just a really big part of it. And then the other piece, and this is maybe like hard to quantify, and this is where the challenge is certainly, right? Like there's a trade-off of like being full stack. And that is the ability for us to not be beholden to a third party, right? And like it is really hard to stomach the idea that like we could be letting Vanguard down because OpenAI quantized the model and didn't tell anybody, right? And that's us literally like not being able to live up to T's and C's to multi-million-dollar customers. And that was just much harder. Or that, you could be completely reliant on a third party who begins to compete with you, right? And we've seen this like with every generation. The other piece of this is really thinking out, right? 2 years, 4 years, 6 years of what is going to happen, right, with the scaling. And it is very exciting to be thinking about being one of only 6 or 7 labs in the world training models from scratch, right? Knowing what our models are going to be able to do in a few very short years. This is incredibly category defining, and our being able to be on the forefront of that, it's a privilege, and we don't take it lightly. The folks we interview and bring onto the research team, they know that they are joining a much smaller lab, but because of that, they've got a much narrower set of problems, right? And it gets productized very quickly, like weeks. We now do more in a 4 to 6 week period than, for many reasons, than when me and Wasim started a decade ago, than we would do in a year. And it's not just because the team is bigger, right? Like we still have a small EPD team. It's only about 100 people. Which is only like 3 times bigger than it was a decade ago, but it is 20 times more productive in terms of what it can produce, et cetera. So sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but kind of walking through all the different permutations of that decision.
Yeah, no, that was great. Super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I do think a general observation from the VC perspective is that building full stack companies is very hard to do. It's a more complex organizational shape to get right. But if you can get it right, it often leads to many of the most successful outsized outcomes. And it's something that we've seen across industries, across categories. So I do think it was a bold bet that clearly has been paying off for you guys. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on one of the most important concepts and most sought after concepts in the world of startups is product market fit. It's a somewhat elusive concept. There's no very clear definition, but I think it's one of those kind of, it when you see it ideas. So I'm curious to hear from Ryder's perspective, how did you know when you really had product market fit with these enterprise customers? What did that feel like? What were kind of the signals within the organization? And then maybe more broadly for young founders who are maybe still exploring in pre-product market fit, like what guidance would you give them in terms of that search for PMF?
Yeah. So I would say first that we are in a constant state of reestablishing product market fit as a generative AI company, because, yes, switching costs aren't high when you've got the kind of governance and controls and like just plugged inness to, the systems that our customers have. And everyone has ChatGPT on their phone, right? And everyone's got like the 2 or 3 different vibe coding tools that they're bouncing between. And everyone's on Twitter, everyone's on LinkedIn. This is such a like radically noisy market. We had Rob join our all hands today at the company, noisier than any other market that has ever existed by a margin, by really orders of magnitude, I think. And the customer is right there, and the end user and the executive just have so much transparency into what's possible. So, product market fit and what the customer gets from you that they can't get anywhere else, right? Which is the essential kind of question, right? Like, how disappointed would you be? Where else would you go, right? All the kind of classic questions we ask to establish that stickiness, that is under constant barrage and attack in generative AI. And like, we see these companies get to 100 mil really quickly, and it's easy come, easy go as everybody switches, right? Like implementation time and just consideration time lead to much deeper usage. But even then, right, there is always a next shiny new object. There is a real, reality in the enterprise that it's 40 vendor pitches a month. We took a prospective customer out to dinner last night, and we met them at a quarterly startup and innovation day. And the CIO there, it's a pharma company, told me that she came away from that kind of 2 days with all the startups thinking, wow, like they met like 15 companies, right? Us and another company, like they're ready for prime time. We did not think that would be possible. But guess what? Like they're going to have another one in a quarter. And I bet it's going to be a completely different set of 15 companies, right? So like even when you win, you are constantly re-winning. So, to those founders, I think I would really say, look, product market fit, this is not 2015, right? It is going to be established and lost, reestablished and lost again, all in the span of 12 months, potentially, right? And just because they're still paying you doesn't mean you still have product market fit. And I think with us, we are really, really focused on just being very honest, right? What they're doing in Writer, can they do it in Copilot? And if not, why not? Do they know that? Are they using it that way? And so, even as we like really parse through folks telling us, right, like, I love Writer, you got to take it out of my like dead bare hands, right? Like us literally using their use case and the other tools they've got access to and understanding the delta for ourselves, right? Because it is definitely a whole range of maturity inside of that organization. And like, we got to do our own evaluation of our product market fit, right? Knowing and looking for the delta. And so that puts a huge amount of pressure on the product team, right? Because like we are constantly going for deeper and for better and for faster. And it puts a lot of pressure on the CS team, right? Because they get customers who are like, well, I just saw this thing from like this 2-person startup, right? Or I just saw a demo on Twitter, right? And we all know how much easier it is to get a demo on Twitter working than like something in production. And so, I wouldn't have it any other way, because you end up with all that progress in a 4 to 6 week period, right? But it's not for everybody. And it really has taken a lot of intentional culture planning and hiring and recruiting to make sure folks who are kind of built for this, right, are in here, or else it's very stressful to kind of live this way, right, of just constantly refinding product market fit, even at a, Series C company with like half of the Fortune 500 as customers.
Yeah, I love that. I love that answer and framing. I think if there's one thing that's kind of a defining characteristic of this era of startups in AI, it's just the relentless pace of change. And the only companies that are successful are the ones that are continuously evolving and bobbing and weaving and finding the next opportunity and being able to adapt flexibly. And that's true of literally every successful AI company today. So I think that's a really helpful reminder that it's not kind of a binary, like, okay, I figured it out, now I'm set in terms of my business model and my product. It's kind of, you need to continuously be changing, and you need to be comfortable changing uncomfortably quickly. On the topic of enterprise adoption and use, obviously Writer, as you mentioned, works with half of the Fortune 500, many of the world's leading enterprises. What would you say is one common misconception that people have about how big companies today are using AI, adopting AI, and the way that they think about engaging with AI products?
Yeah. I think from a misconception perspective, so if I think about like startups trying to sell to the enterprise, I sometimes feel like, like seed stage startup or folks who, we interact with or ask for advice, or companies that me and Wasim are partnered with or invested in somehow to help. I think there is a underappreciation for how innovative these companies are and how sophisticated their usage patterns can be. It's just that it's distributed unequally inside of the company. And, the same company that could be doing really incredible, use cases with us in like finance or sales and marketing could still literally be doing, marketing ops or sales ops with like pen and paper and spreadsheets. And the stacks that are inside of these enterprises are of such different vintages in different eras and are so calcified or so disconnected, it can make scaling innovation really difficult. And so it's like this combination of underappreciation of how innovative they are in solving some of their hardest problems, and then a like, you know, a lack of estimation for the complexity that's required to then scale, right, that innovation. So, you know, I'll give you some examples. Like, we've got customers where, you know, we are trying to MCP into like internal systems or off the shelf systems that they've bought. And okay, for this like one system that does like, you know, compliance workflow, they have 123 instances of it, right? This is a multinational. So how do you get the advantages of scale? This is what agentic is so great at. If we now have to figure out, right, like, you know, is it going to be 123 instances of this AI system? Do we build a sub-agentic system to just simply replace 123 instances? Like, there are people whose jobs and livelihoods are in running those instances. And so, you know, there's a incredible feat and a relief and a like just excitement that we and the customer all feel when we go from scoping to prototype, right? And we do like really, really great co-development with the customer on the Writer platform. And it could be a year between when that prototype, right, gets people really excited, gets shown to the board, and when it's actually like fully deployed in production and we've done all the change management, right, on it. And that prototype could be in production, right? But like connected to live production data, and everyone is using this and the workflow has totally changed and become semi-autonomous, are two very different ideas of what being in production is. And, you know, the customer doesn't save 10 million bucks till the latter has happened, right? And so it just requires a ton more partnership and work and consideration than I think like early stage startups find. And it's probably why we're seeing so much consolidation, right? Like, and it can be very like enticing, but going from a successful meeting to something they can use and scale, and something that 70,000 people, right, have got access to, you know, we know how hard that is and how much you really have to be, how many enterprise features and how much depth you need to have, right? But the upside is like, these are customers who are not buying software. They see themselves as like truly partnering with us. And so that is very valuable. We don't take that for granted. And you get just so many deep relationships. Like, we have seen dozens and dozens of champions get promoted, grow teams, move jobs, get C-suite positions. It's exciting. And our vision is to empower people who are closest to the work to transform the way that they work. And, you know, seeing that up close and personal at all levels of the enterprise is just a very different business than your kind of high velocity prosumer type of business that a lot of the generative AI companies are targeting.
Totally. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. A quick reminder to folks, by the way, to please drop any questions you have into the Q&A. We have a number of great questions from the audience already, but I have a couple more questions I'm excited to hear May's thoughts on, but then we'll switch over to audience Q&A. So please feel free to drop whatever you're curious to hear May's thoughts on into the Q&A. Another topic, May, that I think would be really interesting and helpful to hear your perspectives on, obviously one of the critical elements of starting and scaling a startup is fundraising. You know, maybe a fun element, maybe a necessary evil, but one or the other, something that is a core part of the entrepreneurial journey. And Writer obviously has been very successful and experienced at raising. The company has now raised over $300 million, most recently at a valuation near $2 billion. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like what did you find surprising about the fundraising process as you've gone through it, and what advice, what guidance would you give to founders, aspiring founders, about how to approach fundraising and how to most effectively tell their story to investors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm a weird founder. I actually like fundraising. I mean, I'm happy to not be fundraising when we're not fundraising. But I'm not out there during the year trying to meet investors, like trying to play games. Like, we set out a 6-week period every like 14 to 18 months, and that's going to be like when we fundraise, right? And getting into like just the mindset and the mode of fundraising, I think is important. And so, for us, like now, with Cordoba, we did 2 fundraising rounds, with Writer, with Seed, and then, 3 fundraising rounds. So I've done this. And my favorite part is getting the team internally really aligned around like, what's the story? And we are moving now from OKRs to V2 Mom in terms of it's just a methodology for aligning around strategy. All these things that like we did not do as a seed stage startup, but it's so important now to aligning in a really fast-paced environment. I can't just like pull 30 people into a room and be like, all right, this is what we're doing, guys. Right? Like we've got to really cascade down strategy, et cetera. And so, when it comes to the last couple of fundraising rounds as a more mature, larger company with a lot of capable execs, really like aligning around, we've been telling, of course, we've got a story because it's a strategy story that we tell employees and potential hires. But how do we really look forward? We're planning 3 to 6 months max right ahead. How do we really look forward 3 to 6 years ahead, right? As we tell in potential investors who we're going to be partnered with for a decade, right? What we're doing here, why it's differentiated, what is our long-term view. And I am so excited about just the next story, Rob, that we're going to get to tell the market. Like I won't talk about it on this call, but it really is next level, the type of insight we are now able to understand being just like in the bowels of these organizations and what it's going to really require to run these companies agentically and what we can provide to them as a result. And those are unique insights no other company has, right? And packaging that up to really like bring more capital into the company so we can go achieve that, that's a privilege. And it gives me a lot of energy to be able to, get our exec team really fired up around the longer term journey. And then of course, it's always so fun. Like, Rob, like every time, we close the day on the fundraising on the Series C, like me and the team would get in a conference room and it's like, all right, like who'd you guys like? Who was what? Like we're assessing you all just as much as you're assessing us. And I remember right after the team met you, like everyone was just so excited to work with, like, God, these are the first guys who get it. Oh my God, when he asked XYZ, like your team asked questions that literally nobody had asked us, right, in the previous 2 weeks of meetings. And we're like, God, dude. So like we were very fired up, right, about meeting you all. And so, it takes you out of the day-to-day to think longer term. And that's what this is all about. So, I guess like learn to love fundraising because, if your company is successful, you're going to do a lot out of it. And it can really serve as just bonding moments, for the team, doing something hard together, right? We never really underappreciated the fact that we were doing something that like most seed stage companies don't get to go out and do a Series C, right? And that we never took for granted. We're not going to take the next round for granted. And it's really quite fun to get a bunch of smart people also thinking about your business and, looking outside in about your business. Like you will really understand whether you've got conviction around something, right? When like 20 people ask you why you do X, Y, Z. And so those aren't always easy to like listen to your true north. But once you find that, even if it's against the grain, that is just something that becomes a real pillar, right, in the strategy. So, yeah, fundraising, get good at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words, May, and I think that's a great way to think about it. It's time consuming. It is maybe a distraction from building the core business, but it also can be, fundraising can be such a helpful way to hone your vision, take a step back, zoom out, think about the big picture strategy and narrative and so forth. And so I think that's great guidance to founders to make the most of it and to take, actively take learnings from it.
You've been listening to a special episode of Radical Talks from the Radical AI Founders Masterclass series. A special thank you to Rob and to May, who's co-founder and CEO of Ryder. If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a comment. Thanks for listening.